The biggest mistake you can make is assuming a quiet person has nothing to say. The spring rain had ended just before dawn, leaving the air cool and clean over the American Processing Center outside Frankfurt. Rows of military trucks sat motionless in the gray morning light. Soldiers carried clipboards. Engines hummed. Coffee steamed from tin mugs. It looked less like the end of a war and more like the beginning of a long day. Captain James Carter stood near the entrance of a converted administrative building, checking names against a stack of documents. At 34, he had spent enough years in uniform to recognize every kind of person within seconds. The nervous ones talked too much. The angry ones stared too hard. The frightened ones tried to disappear. But the young German woman waiting near the far wall fit none of those categories. She simply stood there, quiet, motionless, watching. Her name was Clara Weiss, 22 years old, blonde hair pulled neatly behind her head, a plain gray coat that looked slightly too large for her thin frame. Her hands were folded in front of her. Her expression revealed nothing. Around her, dozens of civilians moved through registration lines. Some spoke nervously. Others argued over paperwork. Children wandered close to their parents. Clara did none of those things. She waited. One of the younger American soldiers noticed her first. Private Eddie Reynolds was 19 and rarely allowed silence to exist for long. He glanced toward Clara and smirked. "I think she's been standing in the same spot for 20 minutes, he said. Another soldier looked over. "Maybe she doesn't know where she is." A few men laughed. Reynolds shrugged dramatically. "Maybe she doesn't know anything." More laughter followed. Clara did not react. Not even slightly. She kept her eyes forward. Captain Carter heard the exchange, but said nothing. The jokes were harmless enough. Soldiers had been making foolish comments since armies first existed. Yet something about the young woman felt different. Most people reacted when they became the subject of attention. Embarrassment, anger, fear, something. Clara offered nothing. It was as if the laughter passed through empty air. An hour later, the waiting room had grown crowded. Boots crossed wooden floors. Typewriters clicked from nearby offices. Telephones rang. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through open doorways. Still Clara remained silent. Reynolds noticed her again. "You know," he said loudly enough for others to hear, "if she understands a single word I'm saying, I'll buy everyone in this room a steak dinner." The men laughed harder this time. One mimicked a thick German accent. Another pretended to translate nonsense phrases. Even a few civilians turned their heads toward the commotion. Clara simply lowered her eyes briefly toward the floor before looking up again. Not offended, not embarrassed, just patient. Captain Carter watched carefully. That was the moment something felt wrong. Not because of the jokes, because of her reaction to them. Or rather, the lack of one. Most people who understood nothing looked confused. Most people who understood everything looked offended. Clara looked neither confused nor offended. She looked like someone listening, someone observing, someone collecting information. The realization settled quietly in Carter's mind. The room saw a timid German girl standing alone. But for the first time that morning, he began to wonder if they were all looking at the wrong story. The morning stretched into afternoon. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the administration building and painted long rectangles across the wooden floor. The crowd inside shifted constantly. Families arrived. Names were checked. Papers were stamped. Trucks came and went. Yet Clara Weiss remained almost exactly where Captain Carter had first seen her. By noon, even the soldiers had begun treating her silence like a form of entertainment. Private Reynolds returned carrying a tin cup of coffee. He leaned against a nearby desk and glanced toward Clara. "I still say she has not understood a single word all day." A corporal beside him grinned. "Maybe she thinks we are discussing world politics." A few men chuckled. Reynolds took another sip. "If I stood there that long without speaking, somebody would check if I was still breathing." More laughter followed. Clara remained perfectly still. Her eyes moved occasionally. Nothing more. The strange thing was that she never looked lost. Captain Carter noticed that detail again and again. Lost people searched for clues. They looked at signs. They watched others for instructions. Clara did neither. She appeared to understand exactly where she was. Exactly what was happening. Exactly how long she might need to wait. The hours passed. Outside, the rain clouds had vanished completely. Warm sunlight reflected from rows of parked military vehicles. Somewhere beyond the building, a radio played swing music. The notes drifted through an open window before fading into the distance. Carter signed another document and looked up. Clara was watching a conversation between two officers near the entrance. Not staring, watching. The difference was subtle but important. Her attention seemed focused, deliberate, as though every word mattered. Reynolds noticed her gaze as well. "See that," he said. "Now she is pretending to understand us." One of the men laughed. "Maybe she is collecting military secrets." "If she is," Reynolds replied, "she is doing a terrible job. Half of us barely know what is going on ourselves." The room erupted again. This time a few civilians smiled as well. Clara lowered her eyes briefly toward the papers in her hands. Then she looked up once more. Calm, unhurried, unbothered. Captain Carter felt increasingly uncomfortable with the situation, though he could not fully explain why. The jokes themselves were harmless. No one intended cruelty. Yet every laugh seemed based on the same assumption. That silence meant weakness. That quiet meant ignorance. That someone who chose not to speak must have nothing worth saying. Carter had met enough people to know those assumptions were often wrong. Around 2 o'clock, a scheduling clerk emerged from a nearby office carrying a stack of files. Frustrated, he dropped them onto a desk with a loud thud. Papers slid everywhere. Several soldiers immediately began helping gather them. Voices overlapped. Questions were asked. Instructions were repeated. For a moment, the room became a blur of movement. Clara watched the entire scene unfold. Her eyes followed each person, each paper, each exchange. It reminded Carter of a student studying a complicated lesson. Not confused, learning. The thought lingered with him. Then another detail caught his attention. A map had fallen from the clerk's stack and landed upside down near Clara's chair. Without hesitation, she glanced down at it. Her eyes moved across the page for only a second before lifting again. 1 second, no more. Yet something about the gesture felt practiced, familiar, as though reading complex information quickly came naturally to her. Carter looked away and returned to his paperwork, but the image stayed in his mind. Across the room, the laughter continued. The assumptions continued. The certainty continued. No one seemed interested in questioning the story they had already created about the quiet German girl. No one except Captain James Carter. And with every passing hour, he found himself less convinced by appearances and more curious about what Clara Weiss had chosen not to reveal. By late afternoon, the building had settled into a slower rhythm. The rush of arrivals had thinned. The typewriters still clicked, but less often. Boots crossed the floorboards with less urgency. Outside, the sunlight had softened into a warm golden glow that stretched across the motor pool and painted the windows with reflections of amber and gold. Captain Carter stood beside a filing cabinet reviewing transportation records when he noticed Clara again. She had finally taken a seat near the far wall. A single wooden chair. Straight posture. Hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked as composed as she had that morning. Not restless. Not impatient. Simply waiting. Private Reynolds noticed her as well. "I swear she has not moved more than 10 feet all day," he said. A nearby clerk laughed. "Maybe she is trying to set some kind of record." Reynolds grinned. Most people would have gone crazy by now. Clara remained silent. The comments drifted across the room and disappeared without effect. Yet something else happened. One by one, people began glancing toward her. Not because she was drawing attention, because she was not. The contrast had become impossible to ignore. Everyone else seemed eager to explain themselves, to complain, to ask questions, to fill every empty second with noise. Clara did none of it. The silence itself had become noticeable. Captain Carter watched her carefully. He had spent years interviewing civilians, soldiers, translators, administrators, and refugees. Human behavior fascinated him. Patterns emerged quickly. Fear had patterns. Confidence had patterns. Dishonesty had patterns. Clara fit none of them. Every assumption he made seemed to collapse after a few minutes of observation. A nervous person eventually fidgeted. An uncertain person eventually looked lost. An intimidated person eventually avoided eye contact. Clara did none of those things. Instead, she seemed to be studying the room itself, learning its rhythm, learning its people, learning its habits. A few minutes later, 2 officers entered carrying a stack of reports from a nearby district office. They stopped near the front desk and began discussing a logistical problem involving transportation schedules. Carter was not paying attention at first. Then he noticed Clara's eyes lift toward them. The officers spoke for nearly 3 minutes. Maps were unfolded. Routes were discussed. Dates were mentioned. Clara never looked away. Not once. When the conversation ended, she lowered her gaze again. Captain Carter felt the same strange sensation he had experienced earlier. The feeling that she understood far more than anyone realized. Reynolds eventually wandered over carrying another cup of coffee. "Captain," he said casually, "you have been watching her all day." Carter looked up. "Have I?" "You have." Reynolds smiled. "What is your theory?" Carter glanced toward Clara. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he answered honestly, "I do not have one." Reynolds laughed. "Come on. Everybody has one." Carter closed the folder in his hands. "That is exactly the problem." Reynolds looked confused. Carter continued, "Everybody in this room thinks they already know who she is." Reynolds followed his gaze across the room. Clara sat quietly beneath the afternoon light streaming through the window. Calm, motionless, unremarkable, at least on the surface. Carter folded his arms. "The longer I watch her," he said softly, "the less certain I become." Reynolds shrugged. "She seems pretty simple to me." Carter did not answer, because at that exact moment, Clara looked up from her chair and met his eyes across the room. Just for a second. Nothing dramatic. No smile. No expression. Yet there was something unmistakable in her gaze. Awareness. As though she knew exactly what everyone around her believed. And as though she had chosen not to correct them. The moment passed almost instantly. Clara looked away. The room returned to normal. Conversations resumed. Papers shuffled. Telephones rang. But Captain James Carter could not shake the feeling that the quietest person in the building might also be the most interesting. The day should have been ending. The longest lines had disappeared. Most of the paperwork had been completed. Outside, the late afternoon sun hung low above the rooftops, casting long shadows across the compound. Soldiers were already talking about supper. Clerks were stacking folders. A few civilians waited quietly for transportation assignments. Then everything changed in less than 60 seconds. The front doors opened abruptly. 3 military police officers entered alongside a small group of German civilians from a nearby district. 2 elderly men, a middle-aged woman, a teenage boy. All of them looked anxious. One officer carried a folder thick with reports. Another held a map marked with handwritten notes. They moved directly toward the administrative desks. Captain Carter immediately recognized trouble. "What happened?" he asked. The senior officer removed his cap. "A registration issue." He placed the folder on the desk. "Several families from the northern sector were processed this morning. Some records do not match. Property documents, residency records, identification papers. Nobody can agree on the translations." Carter frowned. "Where is the interpreter?" The officer's expression answered the question before he spoke. "Still in transit." His vehicle broke down 20 miles away. A heavy silence settled over the room. Carter opened the folder and scanned the documents. Most were handwritten. Some were damaged. Others used regional terminology unfamiliar even to experienced administrators. Without accurate translation, decisions would be delayed. Families would remain in temporary housing. Transportation schedules would be disrupted. Resources would be wasted. The problem was not dramatic, but it was urgent. Around the room, conversations stopped. Clerks exchanged uncertain looks. The German civilians waited nervously near the entrance. One of the older men attempted to explain something using broken phrases and gestures. Nobody fully understood him. A corporal tried asking questions. The answers created even more confusion. Within minutes, frustration began spreading through the building. Papers changed hands. Maps were unfolded. Questions were repeated. Nobody had clear answers. Captain Carter rubbed his forehead. The situation was becoming increasingly complicated. Then Private Reynolds offered an unhelpful suggestion. "Maybe we can just wait until tomorrow." One of the officers shook his head immediately. "Transportation leaves at sunrise. We need answers tonight." Another clerk attempted a few words of German from memory. The effort only produced further misunderstandings. The room seemed to tighten. Not from panic, from uncertainty. Carter looked across the building. People were talking more loudly now. Trying harder, accomplishing less. And then he noticed something unexpected. Clara Weiss had lowered her eyes toward the documents spread across the desk. She was not staring randomly. She was reading, slowly, carefully, line by line. Her expression remained calm, the same calm she had carried all day. Captain Carter watched her for several seconds. Something in the room felt different. The noise continued around her. Voices overlapped. Questions bounced from one person to another. Yet Clara appeared completely focused, as though the confusion surrounding everyone else existed somewhere far away. Reynolds noticed her looking at the paperwork and smirked. Maybe she has solved the whole thing already. A few soldiers chuckled. The laughter lasted only a moment before fading into the ongoing confusion. Clara did not react. She simply continued studying the pages. Carter looked at the documents, then at Clara, then back at the documents. For the first time all day, a possibility entered his mind. A possibility so obvious he wondered why nobody had considered it sooner. The room needed someone who could understand both sides. And sitting quietly beneath the fading evening light was the only person who had spent the entire day listening. Captain Carter looked around the room. The confusion was growing by the minute. Clerks shuffled papers from one desk to another. Officers compared maps. The German civilians stood quietly near the entrance, waiting for answers that nobody seemed able to provide. The missing interpreter had turned an ordinary administrative problem into a wall that nobody could climb. Carter glanced toward Clara Weiss. She was still seated beneath the window. The last light of the afternoon rested across the stack of documents in her lap. For several seconds he hesitated. Then he walked toward her. The room continued moving around them. Boots crossed floorboards. Telephones rang. Voices overlapped. Yet the moment felt strangely quiet. "Miss Weiss," Carter said. Clara looked up. Their eyes met. "May I ask you something?" She nodded once. "Nothing more." Carter held out one of the documents. "Can you read this?" Clara accepted the paper carefully. Her eyes moved across the page. One line, then another, then another. Barely 10 seconds passed. "Yes," she replied. The room stopped. Not completely, but enough. Nearby conversations faltered. A typewriter paused. Even Reynolds looked up from across the room. The voice was calm, clear, precise. There was no hesitation, no searching for words, no uncertainty. Carter blinked. "You speak English?" Clara folded the document neatly and handed it back. "Yes, Captain, I do." Her accent was faint, softer than anyone expected. Every syllable sounded polished and deliberate. The room seemed unable to decide how to react. For an entire day, people had spoken around her, joked around her, made assumptions around her. Now those assumptions were collapsing one after another. Reynolds stared openly. "You have been understanding everything." Clara turned toward him. Not angry, not offended, simply honest. Most of it. Nobody laughed. Carter glanced at the paperwork, then back at Clara. "Can you help us?" Clara looked toward the waiting civilians near the entrance. The elderly woman appeared worried. The teenage boy held several folded papers against his chest. The older men exchanged anxious looks. Clara stood slowly from her chair. "I believe I can." Carter escorted her to the central desk. Every eye in the building seemed to follow. The contrast was impossible to miss. Just minutes earlier, she had been almost invisible. Now the room watched her with complete attention. One of the officers handed over the file. Clara opened it. The pages rustled softly beneath her fingers. She read for nearly a minute. No dramatic gestures. No display of confidence. Just concentration. Then she began speaking. First in German to the civilians. Then in English to the officers. Back and forth. Effortlessly. Questions that had taken 20 minutes to untangle suddenly became clear. Names matched records. Addresses matched property documents. Dates that seemed contradictory were explained by local registration procedures. Within minutes, confusion gave way to understanding. The transformation felt almost unreal. Carter watched carefully. What impressed him was not merely her language. It was her precision. Clara listened fully before answering. She never rushed, never interrupted, never tried to draw attention to herself. She simply translated exactly what was needed. Nothing more, nothing less. The room remained unusually quiet. Not because people had nothing to say, because they were busy reconsidering everything they thought they knew. Across the room, Private Reynolds lowered his eyes toward the floor. For the first time all day, he looked uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Clara continued her work with the same calm expression she had worn since morning. As though none of this surprised her. As though she had expected the room to discover the truth eventually. And as the final rays of sunlight faded beyond the windows, Captain James Carter realized that the most remarkable thing was not that Clara Weiss spoke perfect English. It was that she had never felt the need to prove it. For several moments after the paperwork crisis was resolved, Nobody seemed quite sure what to do next. The building felt different now. Not quieter, more careful. Conversations resumed, but the easy confidence that had filled the room earlier had disappeared. Clara stood beside the main desk, organizing documents into neat stacks while officers reviewed the corrected records. The German civilians who had arrived looking worried now appeared relieved. One elderly man removed his cap and thanked her warmly in German before leaving with his family. Clara answered politely and returned to her work. No celebration. No attempt to draw attention to herself. Just the next task. Captain Carter watched from across the room. The contrast was remarkable. An hour earlier, people had treated her like a curiosity. Now they treated her like a professional. The transformation had happened without Clara changing anything about herself. She had not become louder. She had not become more confident. She had simply revealed a small part of who she already was. Private Reynolds finally approached the desk. The usual grin was gone. He shifted awkwardly before speaking. "Miss Weiss." Clara looked up. "Yes." Reynolds cleared his throat. "I suppose I owe you an apology." Several nearby soldiers suddenly became very interested in their paperwork. Clara waited patiently. Reynolds glanced toward the floor. "I said some foolish things earlier." Clara considered his words for a moment. Then she gave a small nod. "You were not the only one." A few soldiers nearby looked embarrassed. Reynolds laughed softly despite himself. "Fair enough." The tension eased slightly. Carter walked over carrying a folder. "Miss Weiss, may I ask you something?" "Of course, Captain." "Where did you learn English?" The question immediately captured everyone's attention. Clara closed the file she had been reviewing. For the first time all evening, she seemed uncertain, not uncomfortable, reflective, as though deciding how much of her story belonged in the room. Finally, she answered, "My father taught literature at the university in Heidelberg." Several people exchanged surprised looks. Clara continued, "When I was 14, he received an academic fellowship in England. We lived there for nearly 3 years." The room remained silent. "Near Oxford," she added. Suddenly everything made sense. The pronunciation, the vocabulary, the effortless rhythm of her speech. Reynolds blinked. "You lived in England?" Clara nodded. "I attended school there." One clerk shook his head slowly. "That explains a lot." Clara smiled faintly. "It explains the language, not necessarily the person." Carter noticed the answer immediately. It was not defensive. It was thoughtful. The kind of response that revealed intelligence without announcing it. He found himself increasingly impressed. The evening continued. More records were processed. Additional questions arose. Clara helped whenever needed. Yet what stood out most was not her knowledge. It was her restraint. She never corrected anyone unnecessarily. Never interrupted. Never acted superior. Even after a day spent being underestimated, she treated everyone with the same calm respect. Eventually, the final transportation documents were approved. Relief spread through the building. Chairs scraped across the floor. Clerks gathered their belongings. Someone switched off a row of desk lamps. Through the windows, the sky had turned deep blue. Night was arriving. As people prepared to leave, Carter found himself looking at Clara once more. Earlier that morning, he had sensed there was more to her than anyone realized. Now he understood something deeper. The impressive part had never been the English. It had never been the education. It had never been the ability to solve a difficult problem. The impressive part was that she had listened to an entire day of assumptions without becoming bitter. She had carried knowledge without displaying it, ability without advertising it, and dignity without demanding recognition. In a room full of people eager to be heard, Clara Weiss had accomplished something far more difficult. She had made silence look powerful. The building was nearly empty by the time the last reports were filed. Most of the clerks had gone home. The telephones were silent. Outside, the compound lights glowed against the darkness, casting pale circles across wet pavement left behind by the morning rain. Captain Carter remained at his desk finishing a few final documents when he noticed movement near the far window. Clara sat alone with a small stack of papers beside her. The room no longer needed her help, yet she had stayed to organize translations and correct several administrative notes before leaving. Carter walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one gently on the table beside her. "You have earned this." Clara looked surprised. "Thank you, Captain." Steam rose into the quiet room. For a few moments neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable now, different from the silence of the morning. Back then it had been misunderstood. Now it felt earned. Carter glanced toward the dark windows. You said your father taught literature. Clara nodded. English literature. American literature as well. Was that why you learned the language? A faint smile appeared. Partly. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup. My father believed languages were bridges. He used to say that every language teaches you a different way to see the world. Carter listened. Clara's voice remained calm, but there was something distant in it now. The sound of someone remembering another life. When we lived near Oxford, he filled our house with books, she continued. Shakespeare, Dickens, Mark Twain, Emily Dickinson. I spent more time in libraries than anywhere else. Carter smiled. Most children would not consider that exciting. Most children probably had better hobbies. For the first time all day, he heard genuine humor in her voice. The conversation continued slowly. Piece by piece, a different picture emerged. Clara spoke of school buildings covered with ivy, small bookstores tucked along narrow streets, rainy afternoons spent reading beside windows, teachers who encouraged curiosity instead of memorization, dreams that once seemed certain. She had hoped to become a language teacher herself someday, perhaps even a translator, someone who could help people understand one another. Then life changed, not through one dramatic moment, through many small ones. Plans postponed, opportunities disappearing, familiar places becoming distant memories. Clara never described hardship directly. She did not need to. The absence of those dreams said enough. Carter found himself understanding something important. The room had spent an entire day reducing Clara to a single label. German, civilian, quiet girl. Yet none of those descriptions came close to explaining who she actually was. She was a daughter, a student, a reader, a person who had carried entire worlds inside her mind while strangers assumed she had nothing to offer. The realization lingered between them. Eventually, Clara looked toward the darkened window. Reflections shimmered in the glass. Do you know why I stayed quiet today? She asked softly. Carter shook his head. Clara considered the question before answering. Because after everything that happened, I learned something. Her eyes remained fixed on the reflection. People often decide who you are before you speak. The room seemed even quieter now. And sometimes, she continued, arguing changes nothing. Carter thought about the laughter that morning, the assumptions, the careless confidence. Clara took a small sip of coffee. I have discovered it is often better to let people arrive at the truth themselves. For a long moment, neither spoke. Outside, a truck passed slowly beyond the compound gate. Its headlights swept briefly across the window before disappearing into the darkness. Captain Carter looked at Clara Weiss and realized that the most valuable lesson he had learned that day had nothing to do with language at all. It was about judgment, about patience, about the difference between seeing a person and simply looking at one. The following morning arrived with clear skies and cool air drifting through the open windows of the administration building. The atmosphere felt lighter than it had the day before. People greeted one another. Coffee cups clinked against desks. Papers moved steadily through the system. Yet one thing had changed. Whenever Clara Weiss entered a room, conversations no longer paused because people underestimated her. They paused because people respected her. Shortly after 8 o'clock, Captain Carter received a message from a nearby registration office. A discrepancy had appeared in a series of property records scheduled for review that afternoon. Normally, such a problem would have been routine, but transportation assignments depended on those records being accurate. Carter requested the files and continued with his work. By midday, the documents arrived. 3 folders, several maps, a collection of handwritten forms from different districts. At first glance, everything seemed correct. Dates matched. Signatures appeared valid. Addresses aligned with official records. Yet something bothered Clara almost immediately. She was helping organize paperwork when one particular page caught her attention. Her eyes moved across the document once. Then again, she quietly reached for another file and compared the information. Captain Carter noticed her expression. Something wrong. Clara hesitated. I am not certain. She reviewed the pages one more time. But I believe there may be a translation error. Nearby clerks looked up. Translation errors were common. Most were harmless. Clara placed 2 documents side by side. This family is listed as residing on Oak Street. She pointed to a handwritten German record. But that is not what this says. Carter stepped closer. What does it say? Clara traced a line with her finger. The word refers to a district boundary, not a street address. One clerk frowned. That seems minor. Clara nodded politely. It would be. Except the boundary separates two registration zones. The room grew quieter. Carter immediately understood the implication. If the boundary had been interpreted incorrectly, every related file could be assigned to the wrong jurisdiction. Transportation schedules, housing assignments, and supply distributions would all be affected. Not disastrously, but significantly. Clara continued reviewing the documents. Her calm voice remained steady. The first translator misunderstood a regional term. The second translator copied the mistake. Then everyone assumed it was correct. She looked up, because it appeared in multiple reports. A long silence followed. The error had survived precisely because nobody questioned it. Carter glanced at the stack of paperwork. How many files are affected? Clara counted quickly. At least 14 families. One of the clerks exhaled slowly. That would have taken weeks to untangle later. Within the hour, corrected notices were prepared. New transportation assignments were issued. Updated maps were distributed. The problem disappeared almost as quietly as it had emerged. Most people in the building never realized how close they had come to creating months of administrative confusion. But Captain Carter knew. As the afternoon sun filled the room, he watched Clara return the corrected files to their folders and resume her work without ceremony. No announcement. No expectation of praise. Just quiet competence. Later, Reynolds shook his head and smiled. You know what is funny? Clara looked up from a document. What? Reynolds laughed softly. Yesterday, everyone thought you needed help. Clara considered that for a moment. Then a faint smile appeared. Perhaps we all need help sometimes. Reynolds nodded. That is probably the smartest thing I have heard all week. And once again, the room discovered that the person who spoke the least often usually gave people the most to think about. 3 days later, Clara Weiss stood near the entrance of the administration building with a small travel bag resting beside her feet. The morning air carried the scent of fresh rain and damp earth. Trucks moved slowly through the compound. Soldiers checked schedules. Drivers reviewed routes. Life continued with its usual rhythm. Yet for Captain James Carter, the day felt different. Clara's transfer papers had arrived the night before. She would be leaving for another processing center farther south. The decision was routine. Hundreds of people moved through the system every week. Names appeared. Names disappeared. Most were forgotten. Clara would not be one of them. Around the building, people found reasons to stop by before her departure. A clerk thanked her for helping correct a difficult set of records. One officer shook her hand and wished her well. Even Private Reynolds appeared carrying a folded sheet of paper. What is this? Clara asked. Reynolds smiled. A list. She unfolded it carefully. Several names filled the page. Soldiers, clerks, drivers, administrators. Beside each name was a simple message of thanks. Clara looked up, surprised. Reynolds shrugged. The room voted. A faint laugh escaped her. The room voted? Unanimously. For a moment nobody spoke. Then Clara folded the paper and placed it carefully inside her bag. Thank you. The words were simple. The sincerity behind them was not. A transport truck pulled toward the curb. The driver checked his watch. Departure time was approaching. Clara turned toward Captain Carter. The noise of the compound faded slightly. The moment felt strangely quiet. I never properly thanked you, she said. Carter looked surprised. For what? For asking. Asking what? Clara smiled gently. Whether I could help. Carter considered that answer for a second. Then he smiled as well. I am glad I did. Clara glanced toward the building one last time. Sunlight reflected from the windows. People moved behind the glass. Ordinary people doing ordinary work. Yet she knew something had changed there. Not because she had solved a paperwork problem. Not because she spoke another language. Because a group of strangers had been reminded that assumptions were rarely accurate. Carter extended his hand. Clara shook it. Neither rushed the gesture. I suspect you will make a remarkable teacher someday, he said. Clara laughed softly. That was always the plan. The driver called for final boarding. Clara picked up her bag and stepped toward the truck. Halfway there, she paused and looked back. Reynolds stood beside the doorway. Several clerks waved. A few officers nodded respectfully. People who had barely noticed her days earlier now watched her leave. Not because she had demanded attention. Because she had earned respect. Clara raised a hand in farewell and climbed aboard. Moments later, the truck rolled through the gate and disappeared down the road. Captain Carter remained where he was long after the vehicle vanished from sight. Eventually, Reynolds walked over and stood beside him. "Funny, isn't it?" he said. Carter glanced at him. "What is?" Reynolds looked toward the empty road. "We spent an entire day thinking we knew who she was." Carter nodded slowly. Then he answered with words he would remember for the rest of his life. "The loudest people taught me very little. The quiet ones taught me the most." The morning sun continued rising above the compound. Trucks came and went. Papers changed hands. Another ordinary day began. Yet somewhere beyond the gates, a young woman carried on with her journey, leaving behind a lesson nobody in that building would forget. She never raised her voice. She raised the standard.